Hello. Often you're confronted with creating something very specific. I did a tutorial recently about a man walking with a hat on his head and then the wind blows the hat away. That's a very precise instruction from your client who says we need this, or we want you to do exactly that. Or another example from a previous tutorial would be write the name of a new product with a pen on a surface with an interesting stroke. So that's another thing. How do we plant a stroke on a piece of paper in 3D and move the camera around? But in many cases it's wise to play with several parameters and use modules of Maya in order to get an overview and get fluent and get acquainted with certain aspects here. For example, this one, I rendered to this last night. It's a Toon shaded abstract object which rotates around one axis, and the camera rotates around it with a turntable animation as well. It has two lights, one is from one side and the other one from another side, two area lights to be precise. You see it has a shiny shader which reflects from time to time, but only very simple lights. It's basically that rectangular area light which reflects here. You have the rim outline, gray sort of, actually it's a ramp, and I just played with it. It has proSets deformations in there, and the basic structure is a super shape. It's basically very simple, but it incorporates several tools within Maya, and I want to show you how you can approach such a thing in a very playful manner. We're not gonna render this object here, we just start with a new scene and see what's coming out of it. The super shape offers quite a complexity at the starting point. These primitives here are pretty simple, and you have to modify quite a bit in order to get some complexity out of them. But right mouse click here and go to Spherical Harmonics. It looks like a sphere, it is a sphere, but then you go to the attribute editor here and to the poly super shape, and when you press random you get already quite an amazing structure like this. And if you like one of them, you can modify them. Go down to Spherical Harmonics, because this is a Spherical Harmonics object. Open this section, and here you can play with the multipliers and exponents, for example. If you reduce the exponent 1, you get a more sharp and precise edge. Like here. You see, it makes it more sharp. Whatever, you can play with all these things. Now, in order to make it even more complex, you can select, right mouse click, faces, this one, that one, that one, that one, that one, that one, and that one, and that one, and that one, and invert the selection by holding shift and selecting the whole object again, so only these are unselected, and then make an extrusion, for example, which makes it really complex. Let's see how we can extrude here. Like this, and like this, and like this, so it gets really complicated now. Instead, what I'll do, because I have the proSets plugin here, which basically increases the complexity of a polygon surface, what I'll do in order to get this ready for production, I click on faces again. I go to the modeling tools here, because now I'm going to select, well, just this face here, and I want to additionally select this edge here. So I go to multi-component, and now I can, with the shift key, select this one together with the face. So the face is selected and that edge here is selected, and now I can go to edit mesh and create a wedge, which is this thing poking out here. Back to the attribute editor, I can reduce the subdivisions to 3, and the wedge angle to maybe 33 degrees. So I have this little thing poking out. Looks not really complex. I go back to object mode, and now with the Alt key I click on the P here. It asks me what kind of history do you want to use now for the new complexity, and there's only one entry here possible. If I had done many more manipulations, I could have chosen one of the list here, but the list consists only of one manipulation. So I continue now. This disappears because I could have done it here or anywhere. It doesn't matter for this plugin really, but now I can change this, for example, and get a very, very complex modification. But what I prefer here is the modulus, and I use the modulus, and all of a sudden I get this complexity here. And that's basically all I need here in order to, I can even look through here, down here, in order to be pleased with rendering. So we can change this. This is a slight modification now because the modulus is so strong. And you can increase this as well, like this. And now I want to render it, and for first rendering it's always good to introduce a sky dome light, which we can later reduce the intensity of or just delete it, but for now it gives us an overview of how the object actually looks like. So next thing we're going to do is we'll create a couple of xGen spheres. What is that about? Well, xGen is here, and we go to this icon which opens the xGen starting editor, so to say, and we create, with this object selected, a new description. And in the description list we choose the spheres and we create them. What it basically does is it places spheres all over the surface, and the density here currently set to 1, which means that's a starting density. We can reduce this to say 0.1, so we have less spheres now. But what we'd rather do is we change the length, width, the depth of the, which is basically the radius of our spheres. We reduce them quite drastically to 0.1, 0.1, and 0.1. You hear the police siren because we're in the center of Cologne here in Germany. Okay, so we have tiny spheres now. Where are they? Well, here's one, for example. Now let's give them another color. How do we do that? Well, first of all, we just check or select this object, right mouse button, and give the whole thing a new material here. Arnold standard surface shader, and that's all. When we render it now, it should look a little bit shiny. Well, it does. Next thing, we're gonna take care of the spheres and the sphere colors, but before we do that, we go back to our collection here. Here we're back at the xGen attribute editor, and here we'll now increase the density to, well, 300. And now we have lots of spheres covering that object. And we need a color for that, for them now. And if you go to the attribute editor here, all the way to the right is the initial shading group, and it's currently a Lambert. That's why it's so gray. You can, of course, break the connection here and add a different shader, for example, an Arnold Toon shader, aiToon. In order to activate the Toon look, you need to go to the render settings, which are here. And under the Arnold tab, you go to Filter, I think this will be different in Maya 2019, but this is 18 when the Toon shader in Arnold was just introduced, and set the type from Gaussian to contour. And the width of the contour lines should be small for so many spheres, so let's try 1 for now. And then we render it. So the basic object in the background, not the spheres, has a standard Arnold surface shader with no Toon look, but the spheres do. And all of a sudden we have such a nice object now, which we can of course animate and do different things with it. We create an area light, and the area light needs to be bigger, and I move it over here. No, over here. That's the direction where the light shines to. Like this, it's this line here. Move it up a little bit. And now I uncheck normalize, and I raise the intensity. That's just experience to do that. And now I render it with Arnold. And the whole background is white because the sky dome shader is so bright. So let's reduce the intensity of this, let's reduce it to 0. So that's what you get now. You only have the light influence from the left. Now I duplicate that light. So the sky dome currently is inactive. I duplicate this with Ctrl D. And I rotate the second light so that it shines at the object from the bottom and from the back. So that's 2 lights at work now. Now I'll change the shader of our main object, which is the super shape here. All the way to the right is the standard surface shader. I use one of the presets now. And for example, clay. So replace the current white shader with the clay shader. Now I could light the whole scene by more intensively, by raising the sky dome intensity from 0 to 1, for example. But instead, let me go to the standard surface shader now. And here you have emission. So this object, a starting object, can emit light as well. You see it emits light now, and you can change the color of that light to a red, for example. So now it glows from the inside. Now I want to do 2 animations. One is cycling the whole object. That's what I'll do first. And it's under animation. Here's visualize, and here's create turntable. And we check the option box here because the default settings are 24 frames, which is very little. We want a turntable animation which doesn't go within 1 second, but rather within 400 seconds. 400 frames, which is quite a bit more. Clockwise, apply. So now we see the turntable camera. When we run the simulation, let's go to 400 frames here, so we extend the range now. We get this animation. It's kind of stuttering now because it has to calculate many spheres here in the scene, but when you render it, it's going to be all right. Here in the description of the xGen world, you have something called displacement, and it's currently set to 0. So let's go to the beginning of the animation. We're currently at frame 15, which is good, and we set a keyframe here. Set a key. So we have 0 displacement. So the spheres, Toon shaded spheres, sit exactly on that surface. And let's go to frame 243, and here we we'll raise that value. We can raise the value to 20, for example, so they really move far away and leave our object alone. And now we set another keyframe here. And when they left the object, that's all we see from it, because the spheres are all over the place now. That's the backlight from the right. And of course, when they disappear, we want this light to go out. So we go to the attribute editor of the standard surface shader, and we'll go back to, let's go here. Here we have still some spheres in visibility. Let's set the emission weight, set a keyframe here, and here we set the emission weight to 0, so it doesn't emit any light anymore. So at this point the scene looks like this. So the star stops shining and we see only the tiny bubbles. So and now I'm going to render this, and now I'll show you the render settings. First of all, you go here, and under common you need to go step by step, and this is really crucial because otherwise you'll miss out something. First of all, file output, choose a name, and I call it Red Dwarf. The image format, I prefer PNG here, but you can choose other formats as well. This is important here, frame animation set. Currently it renders only the current frame instead of a sequence, which is here. It starts here. Name, number, and extension. So the extension will be PNG, and the third image will be called Red Dwarf .004.png. Further down, we need to check the start and end frame. 400 is our end frame. If we don't change this, the animation will stop after 10 frames. So that's one thing. And then, what kind of cameras do we want to render? Not the perspective camera, but the turntable camera. And now, what format do we want to render it in? The presets are lots of presets here. HD 1080, for example, would be nice. The resolution, DPI, that is set to 72, which is optimal for screens. Now you can go, you're basically finished with it, but you can go to the Arnold render settings and increase the camera anti-aliasing here, which I like to do sometimes. The diffuse lighting maybe as well, but I'll leave the rest as it is, because every increase here increases the render times quite dramatically. The type is set to contour, that means it renders the contours of the bubbles. Well, finally, you need to go to rendering, and here you can go to render sequence. If you don't have an Arnold license, you need to do this. If you have an Arnold license, you can batch render it. I don't. I have a student version here only, so I need to render the sequence. If you batch render this, you can do this. You see the watermark of solid angle Arnold in every frame, which is fair enough for an unpaid program. But if you render the sequence, this does not appear. Check the option box here. The turntable camera is selected, and here you can select where you want to put your rendered files. If it's the default location, I think it's the images in the current project, you just choose render sequence, and then the rendering process will start with frame number 1. And you can actually see and check whether that is okay for you, or if it's too big, or if it takes too long. And you see it does take quite long, so this is a typical overnight job now. And if the Toon shading effects are okay, you can only evaluate them at the end of the rendering of each frame, because it's like a post-production for each frame. So this takes some time. If you want to cancel the rendering, you just press escape.